Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, but more importantly, it is officially, well, it has been for a while, but especially now, it is spooky season officially. It's Halloween time, it's my favorite time of the year personally. Halloween's my favorite holiday. I know I'm just cool and alternative like that, I guess you could say, or whatever. My point is, Halloween. I love it dearly. This year, I'm having my costume be a person that girls don't talk to. I think I got it down pretty good myself. And overall, I just love this time of year. I love the fact that people get to just do whatever they want costuming wise, and no one will question you. You dress up as a mummy in the middle of February, and people think that you're a psychopath. But it really is the one singular time of the year where we can talk about, read about, watch movies and TV shows about horrible things happening to other human beings, and we can deny the fact that we're all sociopathic just a little bit, because it's Halloween, so it's different and it's fine. Love this time of year so much, and there's some great music to go with it too, as always, and I wanted to talk about a few albums this year that remind me of the Halloween season. They're not necessarily Halloween albums, but they're scary, they're spooky, maybe they're ooky or kooky, you never know. And today I wanted to start that off by talking about one of my favorite punk albums of all time, The Misfits' Walk Among Us. Walk Among Us is arguably the most famous album from the seminal horror punk band The Misfits, the Glenn Danzig-fronted project that basically pioneered all things schlocky and campy within punk music in and of itself. You could definitely argue that there was a point where punk was taking itself too seriously in certain corners. Some people were taking the ideologies of the Sex Pistols too seriously, or the Clash too seriously, and when a band like The Misfits came along just to talk about zombies and people murdering other people, it was a totally different thing, and it really did reinvent punk in and of itself, at least to some extent. And Walk Among Us is not just an influential album, but it's also a fantastic album as well. Simplicity is the key here, not too dissimilar from a lot of the Misfits' peers. I mean, let's face it, the Ramones only knew 3 chords, the Buzzcocks only knew 3 or 4 chords, and the Misfits only knew 3 or 4 chords overall, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, and the reason the Misfits specifically stand out from a lot of their peers is the fact that they were heavily based around melodicism, which directly opposed a lot of the uprising hardcore stuff that was going on at the time that was more about speed and ferocity than it was actual musical ability, and that's not the same the Misfits had musical ability traditionally. They weren't pulling off some epic dream theater proportions here or anything like that, but still there was a level of melody here, a level of song structure here that wasn't seen in a lot of other bands of the time, like the Germs, for example. Not to say those bands were bad, they were great in their own right, but the Misfits definitely stood out from the crowd with their own brand of punk and their own brand of hardcore. I mean, Jerry Only's bass work and Doyle's guitar work are about as straightforward punk meat and potatoes as you can possibly get, but the way that they manage to structure their songs makes this a compositionally very pleasing record. It's so simple that it suits the overall B-movie aesthetic that they go for, but at the same time it never goes into super lacking in intelligence compositions, for lack of a better word. I don't want to call punk stupid, but there were a lot of bands at the time that were doing things that were significantly less interesting and just more based around how fast can you thrash out, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it does get to be a bit dry after a while, and the Misfits definitely took that and reversed it by still managing to thrash out and do some psychotic sounds and things and the like, but at the same time still managing to be rooted in enough structure that they really could pass as a pop punk or a pop rock band decades later. Now, with that being said, never let it be said that there was no edge to the Misfits, especially on Walk Among Us. They had a level of aggressive, or for lack of a better term, edginess about them that really, again, made them stood out from the crowd, and that was primarily because of frontman Glenn Danzig, a person who is kind of infamous nowadays for being a bit of a knucklehead, but you know what? Damn it, with the Misfits, he was one of the best vocalists in punk at the time, and still is to this very day, if I'm being totally real. I mean, he had a vocal style that was clean, but at the same time, he could still be extremely aggressive, especially on some of the more thrash-based numbers here, like Mommy Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight, and at the same time, he also provided the band all of its lyricism, which really met this nice balance between campy, schlocky, classic B-list horror, and genuinely fearful, frightening, legitimate horror. It was like Ed Wood read H.P. Lovecraft. It was this nice meeting between self-aware, ironic, goofy, and also genuinely at times unnerving if it weren't backed by this over-the-top fun punk instrumental. Look, say what you want about Glenn Danzig. Sure, the dude made that god awful Elvis cover album. He arguably hasn't made any good music in the past couple of decades overall. And there might only be a couple of good albums from him post Misfits, except for, I mean, maybe the first few Danzig albums. Just overall, there's a lot to criticize about Glenn Danzig, don't get me wrong. However, with the Misfits, it's a totally different story. He was amazing with the Misfits, and that especially shows on Walk Among Us. And now this brings me to the point where I have to raise the question, why are the Misfits important? What impact did they have? Why are they worthy to even be being discussed here, on YouTube by people like myself who are still analyzing why the Misfits were a noteworthy band in the early history of punk music? And frankly, they are easily one of the most influential punk bands of all time. You could definitely argue that there were punk bands prior to the Misfits or garage rock bands prior to the Misfits that definitely did work in a lot of fun horror-based themes. There was even this sort of surf rock horror mixture that definitely existed slightly before the Misfits came along and really amped things up, but really the Misfits, Glenn Danzig, Jerry Only especially, were the pioneers of this horror punk style that would go on to influence dozens, if not hundreds, of other bands. I mean, without them, we wouldn't have AFI, we wouldn't have 45 Grave, we wouldn't have Gwar, we wouldn't have Mr. Monster. Even Metallica cites the Misfits as a primary influence, and when the most commercially successful metal band of all time calls you a primary influence, you're doing something right. Even today, we still hear major hints of the Misfits' sound in modern bands that are commercially successful, like the English band Creeper, one of the most popular pop-punk, pop-rock kind of bands out there right now, directly inspired from the Misfits with their Halloween, schlocky, B-list, small-budget aesthetic that they have about them. That all stems directly from the Misfits, and without the Misfits, it wouldn't exist. So overall, Walk Among Us is a perfect Halloween album. Again, the lyricism here is simultaneously goofy, but at the time, it can be kind of unnerving, it can be kind of freaky, it can be kind of unique, it can kind of stand out. I mean, it's definitely something that isn't for everyone. I will say that much. If you are not a punk fan by any means, this is not an album worth checking out. But at the same time, if you are a punk fan and you haven't heard this album, what are you doing? Listen to this album right now. This is one of the most influential punk albums of all time, maybe one of the most influential punk bands of all time, with one of the tightest instrumental sections in the history of punk, melodies that just soar past a lot of the competition of the late 70s punk scene, and the fact that Walk Among Us wasn't commercially successful back when it came out is a damn shame, because it could have ultimately resulted in a wider body of work from this era of the Misfits, but nonetheless, I'm glad that we have this and the couple other works that they did manage to put out. I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review. I have been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.